Hello one and all, today I'll be presenting a project that I've been working on for the past week or so, and that is expected to take up some airtime on my channel over the next week or two. This is a set of sparring decks, and this initiative comes courtesy of Tris. Here is the challenge that was set out by Tris. Given a card pool owned by a veteran, that is 3 of the original core set, 1 of each data pack and big box, and 1 of each world champion deck, build 7 decks simultaneously, 1 for each faction, that are all post-rotation tournament legal. I've added some additional conditions to this myself because I started thinking about the use case of such a challenge, and it occurred to me that these would make for some very good pre-built decks similar in a similar vein as the big boys teaching decks. So you bring these sets of built decks, all 7 of them, to your game night, to your local game store, and when they're new players, they can just grab one of your decks and start playing straight away. That's pretty awesome. And being a competitive player myself, I impose some additional restrictions. That being that I want these decks to be balanced as far as possible when sparring against each other, yet fun to play with meaningful in-game decisions and encouraging good Netrunner fundamentals. This way that new players can learn good basics about the game. And I think quite importantly as well, these decks should exhibit its faction's theme pretty well. So yeah, without further ado, I will present every single one of these 7 decks that I've customized, handcrafted myself. I will also talk about their strengths, their weaknesses, and a bit on how to play them. Because of the intended use case for newer players to get into the game, I will be toning down the speed at which I present my content. That is to say, this will be geared towards newer players. So you veterans who usually watch my channel, I apologize if I'm going too slowly or if I explain cards that you already know their function of. So with that out of the way, let's begin with the corp side. We'll start with the HP deck I built. This is a glacier deck, meaning that it uses a lot of ice, and it is a very strong part of the deck because the ice is very taxing, meaning that it costs the runner a lot of credits to get through. So much so that the runner probably will not be able to pay all the credits needed to get through the ice on the remote server, allowing the corp to score agendas, and that's how this deck usually plans to win the game. The ice can be expensive, but this is supported by the strong campaign-based economy. You can see in the asset section, it's all the campaigns. That will make you a lot of money. So the theme of HB in general is efficiency in the form of big money and big ice. It comes as no surprise then that one of the biggest strengths of this deck is the ice. If you flip through all the ice in this deck, you'll realize one thing. Most of them are good both early and late game. In the early game, these ice often feature punishing subroutines when the runner still doesn't have their breakers out and is unable to break them. This can potentially break a runner's back, forcing them to lose a lot more tempo than they bargained for when they initially made the run. Even late game, the ice is still very good because it still costs a lot of money even for a fully set up runner to run through. This is something that this HB player should abuse in order to score their agendas. Speaking of which, their agendas grant them a lot of raw power. A lot of their agendas either give them lots of money or lots of clicks, and this is very vital when snowballing in the later game to score more agendas. Using your agendas as forward momentum can be a very valuable asset. Weaknesses of this HB deck one very notable one is that it is very susceptible to agenda flooding. This is a term used to describe the corp when their HQ is full of agendas. So they are flooded with agendas, and this is really bad because the runner simply has to run HQ a bunch of times to win the game. This HB deck is particularly weak to this because it is a slow deck. In most other decks, you typically score agendas early and often, whereas here, you typically don't score agendas early because your remote space is usually taken up by your campaigns, your assets. So your agendas will slowly but surely clog up in hand, which is why there are cards such as Special Report and Miraju, which can elevate the agenda flood in hand. Another weakness is that your Bioroid ice can be clicked through. You can see that on the top of your ice, there's usually this clause: the runner can spend a certain number of clicks to break subroutines. This means that even runners that are not well equipped, that don't have their breakers out, can still spend clicks to get through your ice and get to the bottom of your remote. This can be a problem if you are trying to score an agenda early or are trying to get some money going with your campaigns. This is something to take note of, meaning that stacking your ice is usually essential. Finally, this deck is rather honest in the sense that the only thing that can be advanced in this deck are your agendas. So when you advance something in a remote, the runner knows for sure that it's an agenda. So if they can get in, they will steal the agenda from you. This is quite a weakness, but there are ways to go around it. But first, let's talk about some interesting lines of play. Your campaigns must be defended very well, otherwise you will not have any economy, and as such you won't be able to res ice, and that just triggers a domino effect that causes you to lose a game. One very powerful means you have to accomplish this is to defend your campaigns with a Bioroid. This way, if the runner chooses to run and trash your campaigns, you will get your ID abilities trigger, which allows you to res ice very cheaply when the runner passes one of your Bioroid ice, such as depicted in this diagram here. Alternatively, if the runner plays passively and doesn't contest your campaign, you will get the campaign money going. So this is a win-win situation for you. You either get a discounted res on your ice with your ID ability, or you get your campaign money, which means you're making money either way. Another interesting line of play is to jam agendas behind lots of ice. Now this doesn't sound interesting at first, but we'll cover the basics since there are some newer players amongst us. So when you install an agenda in a defended remote, on your next turn, if the runner does not access the remote, you can then score the agenda simply by spending your 3 clicks to advance the agenda 3 times. This works on agendas such as Project Vitruvius, which have a 3 in the top right corner, 3 advancement requirement. What about 4 advancement requirements? There's a bunch of agendas that have 4 advancement requirements. I've highlighted them in this box here. This is slightly tricky to deal with. You will either have to advance the agenda the turn before, which telegraphs it to the runner, as we discussed previously, or you could choose not to advance them, and on the turn you tend to score them. Play a Baltic labor first, which gains you an extra click, which you can then use to advance your 4 advanced agenda 4 times and score it in that turn. So Biotic Labor can be used as such to score a 4 advanceable agenda from 0 advancements within the span of a single turn. And this is important because otherwise you will telegraph the fact that the item you installed in the remote is an agenda. Alright, Biotic Labor is also commonly used, actually very much more commonly used, to fast advance agendas from hand. Now fast advance refers to the act of scoring agenda straight from your HQ. In this example, if you have a Project Vitruvius in your HQ, you can play Biotic Labor, which means that you will have 4 clicks, allowing you to install Project Vitruvius in your first click and triple advance it on your subsequent 3 clicks. This is a very powerful way to close out the game when you are on 5 agenda points, because Project Vitruvius will grant you the last 2 points needed to win the game. So that's the HB deck for you. We'll now move on to the Jinteki deck. This, in contrast to the slow Glacier HB deck, is a fast tempo deck. It's called a tempo deck because it relies on getting ahead of the runner in terms of tempo. Not just in terms of gaining money or agenda points, but more importantly, to disrupt the runner, to lob snowballs and stones at them to make them fall behind. In this case, as the Jinteki faction, this is done by lobbing net damage at the runner, which causes them to lose potentially valuable cards from the hand. In an extreme case, an overly aggressive runner that takes too much net damage can even flatline, allowing you to instantly win the game. So that is what this deck is trying to do. One thing that I must stress that a lot of players can get a misconception of is that a lot of damage-based decks, this one included, is not a pure kill deck. Oftentimes you have a dual win condition. In this case, you can win either by scoring 7 agenda points or by flatlining the runner. You almost never go all in on the flatline. In this case, this tempo deck attempts to force the runner into a lose-lose situation where they have to let you either gain agenda points or take a lot of net damage and potentially flatline. And this can be achieved by this very powerful agenda that you see here, Obo-Carter Protocol. This agenda is worth a lot of points to both the runner and the corp, but for the runner to steal it, they must suffer 4 net damage in return. This is a very painful penalty that can potentially put them in net damage, flatline range, I should say. So the theme of this Jinteki deck is a prickly deck that spikes the runner every now and then and cuts them 1,000 times, hopefully giving the corp an easy victory. So the strengths of this Jinteki deck, well, unlike most other decks, this deck actually protects itself pretty well. Even if you don't place an eyes on R&D on your first turn, the runner has to be careful about running R&D, because if they hit any of your agendas, they will take net damage from your ID ability. Or they could hit an ambush like this Breach Dome here, which causes them to take a meat damage and even trash the top card of the stack, which could be a valuable card. Another big powerful card part about this deck is the Grail Ice. Now this Grail Ice refers to Galahad, Merlin and Lancelot. They all have the Grail subtype that you can see here. And what they have in common, the Grail subtype, is that they are by themselves not very powerful ice. They only have a single subroutine and they are not very high strength. However, if you have multiple Grail Ice in your hand, you can review them when the runner is encountering these Grail Ice and add on subroutines. So for example, if the runner encounters a Galahad by itself, it simply ends the run. However, if you have a Merlin and a Lancelot in your HQ and you show it to the runner while they're encountering the Galahad, you add on a net damage subroutine and a trash program subroutine to the Galahad they are encountering. This can make for a potentially very nasty encounter because the runner will have to be prepared for net damage and program trashing to occur from barriers, code gates and sentries alike. This is a very powerful trait that can potentially give you a lot of time that is needed to score your early agendas, deterring the runner until they have all their breakers available. Well, Jinteki is not without its weaknesses. Even though it can threaten net damage, it is often poor. Surprisingly, scoring agendas takes a lot of tempo away from you. This Jinteki deck also doesn't fare very well in the late game. Its ice and economy simply does not match that of the HB deck we've just seen, and the net damage doesn't exactly lend itself very well to flatlining the runner if they are playing carefully and they still have cards remaining in their stack to take net damage with. So you have to be careful and you want to play this quickly. Win before the runner has an opportunity to lock your servers down. Some interesting lines of play possible with this Jinteki deck. There's this card in this deck called Shipment from Tenin, and it is your fast advance option in this Jinteki deck. While HB relies on Baltic Label to gain clicks, Shipment from Tenin allows you to place 2 advancement tokens on a card in a single click, essentially allowing you to fast advance 3 advanceable agendas from your hand. Just like with the Project Vitruvius we mentioned earlier for the HB deck, this allows you to close out the game if you are at 5 agenda points, meaning that the runner has to be very worried about this option. Early game, however, you can also use this to score some powerful agendas. Brain Trust doesn't do much when scored, however it gives you 2 agenda points, which is important. Every agenda point counts. House of Knives, on the other hand, is worth fewer agenda points but has a very powerful ability, giving you more sources of net damage, which can potentially increase your chances of flatlining the runner. Now, you must keep in mind, very importantly, as the corp, that Shipment from Tenin can only be played if the runner did not make a successful run during their last turn. So this is a very important thing to note. You want to deter the runner from making successful runs so that you can score these agendas. Right. Another interesting line of play is with Violet level clearance. This seems like a very benign card on first sight. It basically gives you more money and more cards. However, it can be used to very good effect in this particular Jinteki deck because it runs Breach Dome. Breach Dome is an ambush that works in every server, but it is particularly effective in archives. It works in archives and the runner cannot do anything about it. Whenever they access archives, they have to take the meat damage and trash the top card of their stack. So this deters them from running archives. No one wants to take meat damage, but this you can use as Jinteki to your advantage. You can stash excess agendas in your archives so that they are safer if you think that the runner is too scared to run archives. So that's a very interesting interaction there. Violet level also pads your hand with lots of cards, which allows you to play Celebrity Gift, which is at its maximum effectiveness if you reveal lots of cards from your hand. So Violet level, a very powerful card in this Jinteki deck. Alright, we move on to the NBN deck. This is played in the Identity New Angular Sol. This is a tempo deck, and it goes on the based on the theme of pervasive suppression. Now, NBN is the media corporation. They have a very widespread reach, and oftentimes this comes at the cost of runners' wallets. And they often end up getting surveillance ends up covering these runners, they get tagged and so on. This is not very much a tag deck, this is more of a credit sapping deck. So this deck basically steals your money and sometimes steals clicks as well with MC Austerity Policy, which we'll see in a moment. And taking advantage of when the runners pour, New Angular Sol then tries to score agendas behind ice. The strengths of this deck include its very cheap ice. Of the 15 ice that it runs, 10 of them actually cost 2 or less to reds, which is pretty amazing. That is very cheap ice, and most of them have an end the run subroutine, allowing you to actually score agendas early, which is quite important for this deck as well. This deck is also strong against resource-reliant runners because of the combination of scarcity of resources and New Angular Sol. Scarcity of resources increases the install cost of each resource, which means that some resources might end up not being worth playing for the runner because they're too expensive. Now, usually scarcity being a current has the weakness that it can be trashed if the runner steals an agenda. So this, unlike other events, scarcity is played and stays on the board, not installed, but it just remains as a current that is in play and is in effect until the runner steals an agenda, at which point it goes into the bin. However, New Angular Sol's ability allows you to replay currents from your bin or your archives, which means that you can perpetually have scarcity of resources up for the entire game, making resources super expensive for the entire game. So this is very strong against resource-reliant runners. New Angular Sol can be weak because of its agenda suite. It doesn't have the best agendas. In fact, amongst the 4 Sparring decks, this has the most blank agendas in the sense that when you score them, they usually provide no benefit. The only exception is Corporate Sales Team, which gives you money. New Angular Sol is also rather weak to central pressure. It has a low ice count, 15 total ice as opposed to the 17 to 18 that we saw from the previous 2 decks. It also features a lot of easily trashable assets and upgrades. You can see here that these have very small numbers on their trash cans, meaning that it's rather trivial for the runner to trash these assets and upgrades and rerun the server, potentially accessing more agendas. Some interesting lines of play available to NBN here. I guess this is not so much an interesting line of play as explaining how MC Austerity Policy works. This is a very central card to this deck, so central in fact that we wanted to import it from another faction, HB. So HB is usually the faction that deals with clicks, and this adds the click denial weapon to New Angular Sol's arsenal. Every turn you can use the ability of MC Austerity Policy to place a power counter, each of these circles is a power counter, on MC Austerity Policy, and doing so will force the runner to lose a click on the next turn. Sounds pretty powerful, but wait, there's more. When you get 3 full power counters on MC Austerity Policy and begin your next turn with 3 counters on it, you can fast advance a 5 advanceable agenda from your hand straight away. This is a very powerful ability. You will have enough clicks to install a Global Food Initiative, which is a 5 advanced agenda, and advance it 5 times, giving you 3 agenda points instantly. This is a huge step forward towards winning the game as New Angular Sol. So one very beautiful interaction of playing MC Austerity Policy in the NBN faction is that Global Food is not the only target for this. Project Bu is a 3 advanceable agenda. However, if you advance it all the way to 5 advancements and score it, it is worth 1 additional agenda point. In effect, it's worth 3 points if you can score it off an MC Austerity Policy. So this is a very powerful part of the deck and is your main way to get agenda points. Another very interesting way to get agenda points is to dump a bunch of cards into your remote and force the runner into a very high stakes guessing game. So you have Red Herrings, which is a defensive upgrade that forces the runner to pay 5 credits more if they want to steal your agenda. If you couple your agenda with a Mombat Virtual Tour in your remote, things can get really ugly for the runner, because Mombat Virtual Tour forces the runner to pay 5 credits to trash it when the runner accesses the Virtual Tour. Remember, when you are scoring agendas, these 2 cards are face down. Or rather, should I say, when you are installing these cards in the remote, they are face down. The runner does not know which is an upgrade, which one's an agenda, which one's an asset. So given that you have a res Red Herrings and 2 unres cards, they have to pick one of them to access before the other, 50-50. If they pick the wrong one, if they pick to access the Mombat Virtual Tour first, they could lose their money from their bank before getting the chance to steal the bill. This could be really important, and the difference between scoring your agenda and having the runner steal it. Alright, we move on to the final deck, Weyland, Building a Better World. This is our Weyland. This is the deck of choice for Weyland, and it is very much a rush deck. You want to get to 7 agenda points as quickly as possible, building momentum as you score agendas. This is a very rich deck that can potentially flatline the runner due to economic superiority and the very infamous combo of hard-hitting news into boom. Hard-hitting news deals 4 tags to the runner and ends your turn. If the runner fails to clear the 4 tags on their turn and passes the turn back to you, you can potentially inflict them with 7 meat damage, which basically kills most runners outright. So that is your secondary win condition if the runner decides to challenge your servers, leaving themselves very poor. Weyland is all about brute force and very punitive measures, and nothing speaks to that more than their extremely hardy ice and their very powerful kill combo. This Weyland deck has some very notable strengths. It has the strongest economy package of all 4 constructed decks we've seen so far. It runs 12 Operation Economy cards in green level clearance, hedge fund, IPO, and 11, Beanstalk royalties. There are only 2 copies of Beanstalk. In any case, all of these are transactions which synergize with your ID ability, giving you 1 more credit every time you play a transaction. And that is very difficult for the runner to disrupt this, because their operations, it is most likely that you can play them without the runner trashing them. Not only that, you gain even more money when you score agendas, and this deck encourages you to score these agendas as often as possible. Oaktown Renovation and Hostile Takeover are agendas that leave you richer than before once you score them. Hostile Takeover giving you a net increase of 5 credits after scoring it, and Oaktown Renovation giving you a credit every time you advance it. Maybe 2 if you advance it further than the 4 required advancement counters. So very powerful agendas that allow you to score quickly without having to worry too much about being poor. On the flip side, this is a very honest deck in the sense that all its secrets are exposed. As Weyland, this is one of their thematic features. There's very limited bluff potential. Weyland is not the kind of corporation that goes around bluffing with face down cards and traps. In fact, some of their agendas, like Oaktown Renovation for example, are installed face up, so the runner knows what they are going up against. So Weyland is not in a very good position to bluff. If you install something in the remote, chances are it is an agenda. The only thing that is not an agenda that can be installed in the remote are the 2 copies of Snare that have been included in this deck, in fact imported from the Jinteki faction. So yes, any advanceable item in the remote is definitely an agenda, just like with the HB deck. Actually, just like with most of the other decks, yes. Another big weakness of this deck is that your main kill card, the Boom, is trashable. You'll notice that unlike most operations, it has a trash can in the bottom right corner, which means that if the runner accesses it from your hand, it can be trashed into the bin and you will no longer have access to it. This means that you actually have to shore up your defenses on HQ if you want to go for the kill. Some interesting lines of play for this Weyland deck. You can potentially win from 4 agenda points all the way up to 7 in the span of a single turn. This is accomplished by playing the card Red Planet Couriers, which allows you to move all advancement tokens from all installed cards to a single card. This is typically your biggest agenda, Global Food Initiative, which awards you the 3 points you need to close out the game. So usually one thing that you can do in such a situation when you are on 4 points is to, instead of advancing your Global Food Initiative, which telegraphs the fact that it's an agenda, you can instead advance your advanceable ice instead. So gaining more and more advanceable ice on your table. Once you have 5 advancement tokens, you threaten the Red Planet Couriers win on the Global Food, and the runner has to think twice. Maybe they really should be running this remote, even though the card is not advanced. It could be a Red Planet food for the win. So the runner chooses to run into the server, accesses the food. Oh wait, that could be a bluff. It's a snare. Haha, got you. So this is one of the interesting and one of the very limited bluffs you can make with this Weyland deck. Another interesting line of play here with this deck is you can abuse hard-hitting news, not just to attempt to land a kill, but also to score agendas at the same time. Just as with the Jinteki deck, you want to fork the runner into a lose-lose situation. Now you'll notice that 4 tags means that the runner basically must spend their entire turn clearing the tags. There are 4 clicks on that turn, it takes 1 click to remove 1 tag. So on the turn you play hard-hitting news, you can install an agenda in your remote, essentially telling the runner, if you clear the tags, you cannot contest this agenda because you have no clicks remaining. If you contest the agenda, well, you're stuck with tags, you might get boomed. So that is a good fork to make for the runner. Just keep in mind that hard-hitting news is a terminal operation, which means that once you play it, it ends your turn. So you need to install and perhaps advance your agenda before playing the hard-hitting news. Speaking of terminal, there's another terminal operation in this Weyland deck. It's the IPO, one of your big economy cards. So you have to be really careful with these 2 cards because you can, by definition, only play 1 terminal during your turn since it ends your entire turn. You don't want to be stuck with lots of terminals in your hand and not being able to play them all in the same turn. Typically you want to play IPO during a downturn when the runner's not running, and you want to play hard-hitting news on the turn that the runner runs, because you can only play hard-hitting news if the runner made a successful run, if the runner attempted to make a run on their last turn, whether it be successful or not. So that's the co-op side covered. Let me take a drink of water before moving on to the runner side. Alright, this is our Anarch deck for our runner side. This, you'll notice firstly that there is no identity here. This is because I purposefully constructed this runner deck to be playable out of any Anarch ID in the current card pool. By default, this is an Alice Merchant deck. We don't really want to mess too much with deck building restrictions, so if you're a new player, don't worry too much about this. Just play this deck with the identity Alice Merchant and you'll be good. For the more seasoned players who know how to deck build, if you're swapping this with another identity, you will want to cut the number of cards in the deck because you want to fit the deck size. You want it to be of the minimum deck size and you want to fit the influence limit. So you have to make the following changes if you're swapping it to any other Anarch ID. In any case, Anarchs are all about disruption, destruction, and chaos. This is a very aggressive deck. I wouldn't say aggressive, it's a very chaotic deck that puts the co-op in terrible position because they find that plans are getting thwarted at every turn of the corner. The strength of this runner deck lies in the fact that they can destroy assets, upgrades, and ice with a lot more ease compared to the typical runner. Assets and upgrades, the co-op will find it very difficult to res their assets and upgrades in the first place, with cards like Hacktivist Meeting forcing the co-op to trash valuable cards from their HQ if they decide to res their assets or upgrades. And even when they're resed, the runner can trash them very easily using Imp, which allows the runner to trash cards for free. Finally, if the co-op is playing more ice-based decks rather than assets and upgrades, well, the ice is going to get killed by cards such as Knife, this set of cutlery that allow the runner to trash ice. Anarchs are also notoriously good at breaking barriers. They have arguably the best fractor in the game in paperclip, being very efficient at breaking barriers. Of course, this is compensated by the Anarch's susceptibility to gear check. Unlike with the other two factions, they don't have a reliable way of fetching icebreakers from their stack. As such, they can easily get gear checked. This is a term used to refer to the state where the runner is unable to get into the corp's remote server because they hit an end run ice that they do not have the breaker for. As such, the ice is serving as a gear check for the runner. An end run ice that say, do you have your fractor or your decoder installed? If you don't, get out. So this is a big problem for Anarchs because the corp can potentially score lots of agendas before they find all the breakers as the runner. Even when they find all their breakers, Anarchs are weak against high strength code gates. Their decoder Black Orchestra is very expensive to use, paying 3 credits every time they want to break subroutine. 2 code gate subroutines. Not to mention that there are lots of high strength code gates out there nowadays. As such, they often have to use this ability multiple times, and the cost stacks up very quickly. This Anarch deck doesn't have a lot of tricks, it just has a bunch of good Anarch cards. One of the most interesting tricks, however, lies in the card that was imported from the Shaper faction, Test Run. This is an incredibly flexible card and very skill testing, I should say. It separates the good players from the very good players. So, Test Run has a lot of things it can do. One of its functions is to tutor a required breaker. Tutor refers to the act of installing, or rather fetching, a card from your stack. In this case, Test Run is able to tutor your icebreakers, which is a very important way to shore up your weakness of not being able to fetch your icebreakers from your deck otherwise. So this allows you to overcome gear checks. In the mid to late game, Test Run also serves another purpose. It allows you to reinstall programs from your bin, and this is very this can be put to very good use because it allows you to trigger the when install clause on your programs again by reinstalling them from the bin. And for programs such as Imp, this means that you can use it multiple times. Let me give you an example. Assume that Alice has installed their Imp a long time ago and has been using the virus counters to trash their opponent's cards for free. Now the Imp is out of virus counters, so Alice decides to override the Imp by installing another program, putting the Imp into the bin to free up memory space. Now usually this program is in the bin and is no longer usable. However, with Test Run, Alice can install the Imp from the bin, and now it has 2 virus counters on it, allowing Alice to then in the same turn run on the opponent's servers and use these virus counters to trash cards. At the end of Alice's turn, according to Test Run's text, the program must be added to the top of the stack at the end of the turn, meaning that Imp has to go back to the top of the stack. This is usually not a good thing since it is now uninstalled, but in the case of Imp, this means that Alice can draw the Imp next turn and reinstall it, gaining 2 more fresh virus counters, allowing her to gain so much more mileage out of the Imp than just the 2 initial virus counters it started out with. Test Run is a very flexible card that has a lot of users, and it can do anything from disrupting your opponent by using lots of Imp counters, or it can fetch you a very key breaker that you're missing. So that's the Anarch deck. We move on to the Criminal deck. This will be played out of a fixed identity in Leela Patel. This Criminal deck has a lot of Criminal decks traditionally used to have very strong early games. They are very offensive, aggressive, and they play very quickly. They tend to snowball out of control if the corp is not careful, and this particular deck exhibits that very well. Corps that try to go too fast will get knocked down by Leela's ability, which we'll see in a moment. And if the corp doesn't have enough defenses, Leela can easily deliver a 1-2 punch to take them out before they even know what happened. Alright, the strengths of this Criminal deck are that, like as with some criminals, it is able to break sentries very efficiently. Fairy is a very powerful breaker, even though it's a single-use breaker. After an encounter with the ice, you have to trash the fairy. However, it breaks that ice super efficiently, costing 0 to break sentry subroutines. So yeah, and having a 0 install cost as well. This is incredibly efficient and a good way to a good get out of jail free card in the early game against nasty sentries. Now, another powerful aspect of this deck lies in your ID ability itself. Leela Patel is able to bounce cards back to the Corp's HQ. This is a colloquial term used to describe sending an installed card from an opponent's board back to the HQ. Oftentimes you'll be using Leela's ability on ice, so you'll be bouncing ice back to their hand, and this can be very devastating because when you remove ice from their board and put it in the Corp's hand, that opens up that server because it now has one less ice guarding it. You can potentially assault that server with a barrage of your own powerful tools. Criminals are known for their powerful events and, or should I say, their powerful cards which allow them to do very nasty things when you successfully access a central server. And this Leela deck is able to pressure all 3 centrals very well. If R&D is left open, Leela can potentially play the Maker's Eye, which allows them to access multiple cards. If Archives is left open, Leela is able to sneak in through the back door and get a successful run on HQ instead. And if you let criminals get successful runs on HQ, you know you're going to be in big trouble as the Corp. This Leela deck has a bunch of ways to punish an open HQ. They are able to install Political Operative, which requires a successful run on HQ in the same turn. And it's a very powerful way to neuter the Corp's upgrades and assets. Alternatively, Leela can choose to play Emergency Shutdown, which saps away at the Corp's credits because it forces them to de-res a piece of their ice. If it's an expensive ice, the Corp won't be too happy about that. Of course, Leela has its own weaknesses as well. Being very strong in the early game, it compensates for this with a very weak late game. Because you don't have any sustainable economy source, all your economy is basically contained in these events as well as Bank Job, which is a one-off resource. So in the late game, you're basically forced to click for credits. Your economy engine will definitely be worse than Anarchs or Shapers. You are also very lousy at breaking barriers. While sentries are good for you, barriers are often bad. You have a very low base strength barrier breaker that is not cheap to install and costs 2 to pump each time, so it can be very awkward to break even strength ice. Alright, as a criminal deck, you have endless lines of possible plays, too many to enumerate. A lot of them are board state dependent. But here I'll just explain something that you can abuse with Leela's ability that most newer players might not be aware of. One of Leela's strongest points is the ability to bounce advanced agendas. So say the Corp is having a good time, they have a very well defended remote, so well defended that you cannot possibly get in, and they simply install and double advance what seems to be an agenda behind the remote. Even though you cannot contest this remote as Leela, you can do some nasty shenanigans. Your ability allows you to add unrest cards to HQ, and this includes advanced agendas as well. Not only do you prevent the Corp from scoring an agenda when you bounce it back to HQ, they also lose the advancement counters, which means that the Corp is set back massively in terms of tempo. They've essentially lost their entire previous turn. So how do you do this? You can try to access as many cards from centrals as possible. If you hit an agenda on a central, you can then bounce your opponent's advance and install agenda back to their hand and make them very sad. Alright, so criminals, very deceptive, tricky runners. What about this one? Shapers are more honest runners and they are just trying to do their thing and show off. Shaper decks typically feature a lot of moving parts, in contrast with the other previous 2 decks we've seen where every card does something straightforward. There are lots of cards in this Haley deck that require other cards to be played, kind of like a combo in order to get maximum potential. Technical Writer, for example, requires you to install lots of hardware or program beforehand before you can gain lots of money from it. Aesop's Pawn Shop does nothing by itself. you need to trash another of your installed cards to gain money. So as you can see, it can be a bit clunky, a lot of moving parts, kind of like gears in a machine. Now, this Haley deck screams Shaper, and Shaper means a lot of things. Shapers tend to be very amorphous, meaning that they change shape at will, morphing the rig basically morphing the rig to fit the needs of the current matchup. This is most clearly exhibited with their trademark card self-modifying code, which allows them to install programs at paid ability speed, meaning that you can install a program during a run. This is something that the other factions have very limited access to. This allows you to tutor up the correct solution for the ice that you're currently facing against, allowing you to break it very efficiently. And this Haley deck packs a lot of right tools for the right time. As you can see, their breakers are very diverse, and David is also a pseudo breaker in that can also break subroutines. So you can fetch a lot of the correct tools at the correct time, and as such is one of the skill testing aspects of this deck. It trades out some disruption ability, unlike criminals and anarchs, which can potentially steal credits from the corp or destroy cards more easily. Shaper decks typically don't have that much interaction with the corp in terms of disrupting their game plan. As such, the runner, you have to focus more on efficiency with your economy cards and efficiency with your breakers. Speaking of efficiency, this Haley deck has some cards that pay off very well in the long term. U-Backs, for example, is their console, which allows them to draw a card every single turn. This means that as the game goes longer, U-Backs will pay off more and more, leaving you with a very unstoppable runner in the late game due to all the trickle effects that come down from cards such as U-Backs, along with like Technical Writer and Aesop's Pawn Shop, two cards that we saw previously. Shapers are also excellent at decoding code gates. You can see that one of their code gate breakers in this deck is Cyber Cipher, which has a base strength of 4. That is ridiculous. You don't often see that on breakers, such a very high base strength to begin with, and at a measly 2 install cost. Of course, this can only be directed at a single server. So if it's directed on R&D, for example, you cannot use it to break remote ice. But nonetheless, it gives you a very efficient option for a single server. Shapers are also able to get in when you least expect it, and as such are a very fearsome force to be reckoned with. As a general rule of thumb, if you're playing against Shaper as the corp, you should always expect that they can get into your server. It's just a matter of whether they want to or not. Weaknesses for the runner include its slow setup overhead, or rather huge setup overhead. Because a lot of these cards that give you more money and cards such as U-Backs are expensive, they typically have to wait a few turns before they pay out, and as such, a corp can easily rush them out, meaning that they score lots of agendas before the runner can even think of contesting them. Shapers are also weak at breaking sentries. In fact, this deck was specifically designed such that you have a very hard time breaking sentries. The low strength sentries can be broken fairly efficiently by Femme Fatale with only 1 credit to break each subroutine. However, at 9 install costs, you probably don't want to be using this very early on. For the bigger sentries, on the other hand, David is a very good option. As long as it's 5 strength or above, you can break sentries with David. However, this comes with a limited number of power counters, so that's a downside. Typically, your middle ground with sentry breaking is with this AI breaker, Brahman. So this deck is kind of centered around Brahman, which we'll talk about more later on. But yes, this is something to be very aware of when whether you're picking up this deck for the first time or whether you're passing it to a new player. You need to inform them that this deck has very few good sentry breaking options. Chances are you need to start the run with a lot of money if you plan on breaking sentries. Alright, another questionable weakness is that this deck is very hard to pilot because your ID ability is very hard to use. Now, this ability sounds easy at first glance. It allows you to install 2 cards within the span of a single click. However, using this correctly, optimally, is the tricky part. Imagine a scenario where you have these 2 cards in your hand, a cash which gives you money, and one of your breakers, your barrier breakers. You want to install the cache because you are quite poor right now, so you do that, and you have money left over to install your barrier breaker. But do you choose to do so? Hayley's ability is optional. If you choose to use her ability, you might put yourself at too low a credit level, and you might not even need this barrier breaker at the end of the day if the corp does not have any installed barriers. On the other hand, if you choose not to install the barrier breaker, you will be not maximizing your ID ability, and as such you'll be playing less efficiently than you could possibly be. So trying to maximize your efficiency while still making optimal plays is very difficult indeed, and it's a very skill testing part of this deck. Now, some interesting lines of play. I want to talk about Brahman here because this is a pretty tricky breaker to use as well. Brahman is a very good breaker at first sight. It has very decent base strength, and it's an AI breaker, meaning that it can break subroutines of any ice subtype, barrier, code gate, sentry. The downside to Brahman is that it has a very nasty clause at the end, which forces you to bounce one of your installed breakers back onto your stack. Sorry, not breakers, one of your installed programs back to the top of your stack. It cannot be a virus program, so that's an additional limitation that you have to be aware of. And this is quite nasty because, let's face it, who wants to uninstall their own programs? You're setting yourself back in terms of both money and clicks. However, in this deck, you can use this to your advantage. If you bounce cards that have power counters such as David or Cerberus Lady, you can then draw them, redraw them, reinstall them, and they'll come with fresh counters, allowing you to break the ice subtype again. This is a very powerful way to recur your David or your Cerberus Lady, and use Brahman to your advantage that way. You can also do the same with Cyber Cipher, which is the decoder that is fixed on a single server. If you feel like you no longer have a need for Cyber Cipher on that server, you can bounce the Cyber Cipher back to your deck and then draw it and reinstall it, targeting a different server. Finally, you have Technical Writer. So when you are reinstalling all these programs, the Technical Writer adds up, gaining you a credit every time you reinstall a new program that you can liberate at your own, at a time of your own liking. So yes, the key to playing this Brahman-based deck pretty well is using Brahman's downside as an advantage for you. Another interesting line of play that newer players might not be aware of is that you can use Hayley's ability during a run as well. Of course, this means that you need to be able to install programs during a run, which you can, as we mentioned, with self-modifying code. So, if you make a run with self-modifying code installed, you can then use self-modifying code's ability to install a program from your stack. This triggers Hayley's ability, which allows you to install a program from your hand. This means that even if there's a program stuck in your hand, you can still install it during the run, as long as Hayley's ability is available to you. And you can even double down on efficiency by making a StimHack run. StimHack gives you 9 credits, which can only be used during the run. So it's a very awesome economy card. However, it has the restriction of being usable only during a run, which means you can't use this money to install your resources or play your events. You can, however, use this money to pay for your self-modifying code installs and your Hayley program install, giving you a huge discount on all these programs that you're bringing out. Efficiently utilizing StimHack is yet another way in which you can increase the efficiency of your deck and overcome the high setup overhead that this deck otherwise has. It's a very skill testing deck, but a very rewarding one to play. So to close out this entire video, I would like to note that these decks are still works in progress. These decks are definitely subject to change. I haven't tested them extensively. Some of these matches might not be balanced, and as a result, I might need to tweak one or more of these decks. In particular, with regards to balance, I think the runner side is generally favored when both sides play optimally. Simply because the corp deck is open information, and typically corps are more reliant on runners in terms of leveraging hidden information and converting it into a victory. For more experienced players who are not really into fixed decks, I still strongly encourage you to use these decks at local meetups to play against and play with new players, I should say. So you can spar with them using these fixed decks. Maybe even set up a league with only these constructed decks available as the options. I think these are very good ways to get newer players into the game, because these decks can simply be neck deck off, and they are constructed such that you will have good games when these decks are pitted against each other, while still being usable when you play against decks out in the wild. Sure, these decks might falter against meta decks, for example. If lots of meta runners are playing Film Critic, the Jinteki PE deck might be really bad. But in general, it should hold its own fairly well, and against the other sparring decks, you can expect pretty good matches from it. That being said, because these decks are not perfectly fine-tuned, if you decide to play these decks and have experiences, I would absolutely love it if you can share these experiences with me, or leave some feedback so that I can improve on these decks in future iterations. Well, as for the rest of you viewers, you can look forward to me featuring some sparring bouts featuring these decks. I will try to tone down for the newer players who might be interested in watching me pilot these decks, and I will try to explain certain key plays for players who might not be very familiar with Android Netrunner as a whole. So I'm going to do a bit of exploring. I'm going to explore more newbie friendly content, and hopefully this will be something that is rather successful. But not to worry, this will only last during this drought period, where there are no new data packs coming out for the near future. Until the first data pack of Kitara Cycle comes out, I think this will be a good thing to occupy everyone's time, and perhaps revive your interest in the local meta, especially now that the revised core set has officially been printed in stores. Once again, thanks to Tris for such a wonderful idea. It was a very fun time deck building all these 7 different decks. In the meantime, as always, thanks for watching and happy net running. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.